So now that I've got my brick wall built and assembling and coloured, now I'm going to bring in my Lego truck. So I've got another scene here which has my truck in it. And if you have a look at the object manager, it's got a whole bunch of objects that make up this truck. And we're going to turn this into a MoGraph object so that we can use our effectors and fields with it. Now, I think from memory I got this truck from TurboSquid. If you go to turbosquid.com, there's all sorts of 3D models here. I've just searched Lego and there is an awful lot of stuff here. A lot of these are commercial and obviously you have to buy them, but if you go to the price section once you've searched, you can look for free models and that will show you which ones are actually free. So there's quite a lot of free stuff on TurboSquid, great place to get 3D models. Okay, so here's my, my truck that I've got, and I want to put it into my brick wall scene. So how I'm going to do that is go to my file menu and I'm going to merge these projects. So I'm going to browse for that truck. Here it is here in my folder, and it's going to bring in my truck into the scene. So let me just jump out of my camera, and here it is in the scene. What I'm going to do is turn this into a MoGraph object, and the way to do that is to use what's called a MoGraph Fracture object. Now this fracture object, it doesn't break things apart. The Voronoi fracture does that. This actually is a way of turning any 3D object in Cinema 4D into a MoGraph object. So if I create a fracture, what I'm going to do is select all of the parts of my truck. So I'm just shift selecting those. Whoops, I don't want the fracture. And I'm going to drag and drop them into the fracture. So those are all children of the fracture, and they are now MoGraph objects. So I can grab this fracture, and what I'm going to do is just reposition it out in front of my wall, and I'm going to spin it around a little bit. So it's parked there. Let's have a look through my camera and see how that looks. That looks pretty good. I'm just going to move it a little more. Great. Okay, so I want this truck to assemble in a similar way to the brick wall in the background. So let me just jump out of my camera again, and I'm going to go through the same process that I did for the wall. And I'm going to make a plane effector and a random effector, but I'm going to do the random effector a little differently. So I'm going to select my fracture, go to MoGraph Effectors and make a plane effector, and rather than drop these pieces down from above, I'm going to do them from one side. So let's shift these parts to in the X direction and in the Z direction and in a bit of Y as well. So that truck is up in the air over to one side. Maybe I'll bring that forwards a little more. So it's going to fly down into space over the shoulder of my camera. Okay, so there's my plane effector, and what I need now is a field, exactly the same way as I used a field in this. So let's grab a linear field. Let's just click and hold that button and get linear field. And as I drag this through, so that's assembling my truck. You can see from from the front to the back. I'd quite like it to assemble from the back to the front. So if I go to my my plane effector and field that I have here, I might change its direction to -X, and that means it drives through and draws that from the back to the front. So I'm pretty happy with that. So let's set up some animation for that field. I'm just going to shift it a bit closer to the truck so it's a bit easier to see, and I'm going to drive it to the right until all those pieces of the truck have reassembled up there. Somewhere about there, and I'm going to start this a little later as well. Let's start this at say frame 25 and keyframe that. I'm going to go forward to frame 100, so it's 3 seconds, and let's drive this through until the whole thing assembles. I might just widen that out just a little bit and keyframe that again. So I've got 2 keyframes now, frame 25 and frame 100. What I might just do is just turn off my brick wall while I'm doing the truck, just it's a little distracting there. So if I go to layers and let's hit the visibility icon, and now I can just deal with my truck. So here's my truck tumbling into place. That's great. Let's just hit play and see what that looks like. I might actually slow that down a little bit. I'm going to grab that keyframe, make sure you've got your plane effector and its field selected. Then I can see its keyframe and I can just click and drag that another second down my timeline. I just want that one a little slower. Okay, so that's good. Now I want to get some randomness in here again as well. Now I can do this the same way as I did with the brick wall, but I'm going to set up my fields a little differently. So I'm going to grab my fracture, go to MoGraph effectors and create a random effector. And in that random effector, I'm going to go to its attributes, and in its parameters, I'm going to change its position values to maybe 150. So there's a little bit of positional randomness. And I'm also going to turn on rotation, and let's put these on 180. So there's a whole bunch of random rotation going on with these. So there they are, all randomized. Now I'm going to set up my field differently for this. In the brick wall, we reused our linear field to control both the randomness and the position. I'm going to set up something a little different for this. First of all, what I want to do is set up my randomness for the truck so that these pieces are actually spinning and tumbling a lot more in space as they fly through. The way that I can do this, if I go to my random effector and go to the effector tab, I can actually set the randomness to change over time. So in the effector tab, if I change the random mode to maybe turbulence, if I hit play now, what you can actually see is the randomness is animated and these points are all spinning and tumbling in space. So what I'm going to do is, first of all, I'm going to slow that tumbling down a little bit. So animation speed, let's make that maybe 50%. So it's spinning a little more slowly. Actually, it's still a bit fast. Let's go down to 25. There we go. So we've just got a bit of tumbling and spinning going on here. In the scale of the animation, we can change that a little bigger if we want to. And I'm also just going to switch on this indexed button here. What this does is it makes sure that each individual piece rotates randomly and a little differently. So what I've got now is this animated tumbling and rotation, which is just going to give me a little bit more movement for these. So that's great, but now obviously I don't want this random rotation happening while my truck is assembled. So I need a field to control this. Now last time I used this linear field and I reused it. I might just test that and see how that works. So if I go to my random effector, go to fields, drag and drop in my plane effectors field. Let's see what happens here. Okay, nothing's happening there. That doesn't really work. So this is a situation where sharing fields doesn't actually work because I've got too many different things going on. So let's remove that field. Just select and hit delete to remove it. And I'm going to make a custom field for this particular random rotation. So let's grab our random effector, go to fields, and rather than make a linear field, I'm going to make a spherical field. So if I click and hold that button down, I'm going to make a spherical field, and let's just drag it off to one side so I can see it. So here's my spherical field. It's very small, so I'm going to click and drag on this little dot here just to make it bigger. So what this means now with this field, it's way too big, is that the randomness, let's hit rewind and play, the randomness only occurs inside this field. So as you can see at the moment, the truck's sitting up in the air, all its parts fly down, nothing's happening. So what I need to do is position this field in the middle of my truck as it's flying so that the randomness occurs there. So I'm going to scrub to about frame 70 where the truck is partly assembling, and what I'm going to do is position this field in the middle of all these pieces. So if I drag this around, I had to spin my view around a little bit here and tumble it around, and as we can see, as we start to drag it into place, now we're actually seeing that randomness starting to appear inside the field. So let's just move that around a bit. You can see this happening. So as I said, the randomness only occurs inside this field. So what I have to do is make sure that this field, first of all, that it doesn't cover any of the truck at the end of the animation, because that's where the randomness is happening. I think that looks about right. Now the spherical field here that we've got, you can see there's two parts to it. There's an outer ring and an inner ring. The inner ring, this is where the full rotation and randomness is happening. Outside of this outer ring, there is no randomness happening, and between these inner and outer rings is where it sort of blends from full to off. So I can change how much sort of fall off I've got for my field. So inside this smaller ring, this is where all the randomness is happening at full speed or full noise, or whatever we've got set there, it's all on full, and then it drops off to the edge, and then it's not random outside of that. So let's have a play here. So what we can see is this sphere is intersecting a little bit of the truck here, so we can see there's some randomness going on there. And if I hit play, I'm guessing these will start to tumble a little bit. There we go. And then as they fly through, they're spinning and tumbling as they go through the field, through the randomness, and then they go out the other side and they're no longer random. So this is just really a different way of creating a random effector and controlling it with a different type of field. And this really shows how fields work, is that whatever effector you've got, its effect happens inside these fields. So you can position these fields anywhere in 3D space and control how your effectors are working. So that seems to be looking pretty good. Let's have a look through the camera. Obviously I don't want to see this when I'm in the camera at the start. So if I jump into my camera, yep, that's out of shot. The field I can see, but we don't see the field. It doesn't render at all, so that's not a problem. But the main thing is the other parts of the truck are out of the camera shot to start with. So that's all looking pretty good. So let's go to my layers and just turn my brick wall back on. And there's my brick wall forming and my truck coming in. So that's all looking pretty good. I like that. Okay, so now let's set up some materials for the truck. Okay, so my brick wall in the background is quite colourful. It's got all these colours, yellows and blues and reds. I don't want my truck to be super multicoloured because I think that will be visually a little bit too busy. So I'm going to put one colour on the truck, but it would be nice if there was a bit of variation in the shades so that all the different pieces of the truck were slightly different shades of the same colour. So let's have a go at that. First of all, before I do any more of that, I'm just going to tidy up my object manager. So here's my fracture. I'm going to drag my plane effector underneath it, and I'm going to grab my random effector and put that under the plane effector. Now again, I don't want them children of each other. I just want to sit them one underneath the other. I'm also going to put them, actually no, I won't put them in the layer just yet. I'll make my colours first, and then I'll put all that in a layer. The other thing, it's a good idea, I've got a plane effector for the fracture. So what I might do is just call that plane frac for fracture, and that's the random effector. Let's call that random frac, just so I know which effectors are controlling or associated with which MoGraph objects. In MoGraph, often you can end up with a lot of different MoGraph objects and effectors and fields. Really good idea to name them as you go along. Okay, so let's set up a material now. So let's make a new default material. And I'm going to make this, I quite like red, I'm going to make a different type of red material here. Let's call this one red truck. Now, what I did with the brick wall was to make several different coloured bricks with different materials on them so that I got this randomness. If I have a look at my fracture with the truck, there is a lot of different pieces in this truck. I don't really want to go through and put a different material on every single one of those. That's pretty tedious. So I'm going to use an actual MoGraph material or MoGraph Shader so that I can build the randomness a lot more easily in my material rather than in each individual object. So this red truck material that I've got, I'm going to double click it. In the color section, in the past I've just been adjusting color using the color sliders here. What I can actually do is I can add a different type of material texture in here, which is a different way of controlling the color. So I'm going to hit this little drop down arrow, and in this list that pops up, I've got a bunch of MoGraph textures, and I'm going to create a thing called a multi-shader. So now in my color section, I've got a multi-shader. To adjust this multi-shader, I'm going to click on multi-shader, and this takes me inside the shader. So what this actually does is it gives me several different colors in a list here. And what I can do is use a random effector to randomize which MoGraph objects from my fracture get these different colors. Now, what I said before is I only really want one color, but I want variations of it. So what we can see here in this multi-shader, I've got currently two different textures, texture 1 and texture 2. There's nothing in these at the moment, a blank. So next to texture 1, let's click this drop down arrow again, and I'm going to make a color. And on this color, let's click on color, and I'm going to set this to red. Now, what we're actually building here is like a sort of a tree of materials and textures. So if I go back to my color material here, in my material list, here's its texture, here's that multi-shade that I just made it. If I click on that, that takes me inside it, and here's the red that I just made. And if I click on that red, here's where I actually adjust it. Now, I can navigate my way through these different layers of the shader by clicking on color to go back to the basic shader and then going through them. I can also use this little up arrow that's in here as well. So for example, now that I'm in my multi-shader, if I click on the color, if I want to go back up to the multi-shader, I can click up and I'm back in the multi-shader. If I click up again, now I'm back just in the root of this color setting that I've got here. So it's like a tree. It sort of branches out underneath all these settings. So here's my multi-shader. Let's click on it again. So my first color that I've got on my multi-shader is red. So I'm going to repeat this process. Here's my second color. I'm going to click on that and set it as a color, go into it. And this, I'm going to make it red, but I'm going to make it a slightly different shade. So I'm just going to change the brightness value and make it a darker red. So let's go up again. So now I've got red and a darker red. I want a few more variations. So what I can do in my multi-shader is I can add another color. So if you're a little bit lost there, jump back up to color, go into your multi-shader, add another color. So now I've got texture 3. Let's make this just a plain old color. Let's go into that color and set it. So let's make it red. And in this case, let's make it slightly brighter. Let's go back up. So now I've got 3 different reds here. Let's add another one. Add a color. And in my color, let's make this one a little bit darker again. So those all look slightly different. So what I've got now is these 4 different shades of red inside my multi-shader. So let's click on color. So there's my multi-shader there. When I go into it, these are all my different shades. I can add more if I want to. I can turn them on or off, and I can go into each one of these individually and change them. So this is my red truck multi-shader now. So let's put this material on the fracture. Here it is here. Now, we need to tell the material to randomize all those colors and place a different shade on each one of these pieces. Now, I've already got a random effector for this fracture, but that is controlling the position and the rotation of the bricks as they assemble the truck. I'm actually going to create a separate random effector just to control the color. So let's go to my fracture menu, my fracture object, go to MoGraph, and I'm just going to create another random. So let's call this one, just so that we know what it is, random color. And I'm just going to put this underneath the fracture. And so what we can see here, once I've made my random effector, automatically it's shifting all my Lego pieces apart. I don't want to change any more position or rotation stuff for this randomizer. All it's going to do is control the color. So let's select it, go back to its attributes, and in the parameters tab, I don't want to randomize the position. all I want to do now is I want to go down to this color mode and randomize based on the effector. So this is just saying this random effector is randomizing the color in the shader. That's all we need to do. And what I can see now, let's just jump out of my camera for a second and getting close to the truck, I can actually see there is a few different shades of red on my truck now. So that's looking like it's probably going to work. Let's jump back into the color, into the camera, and let's just do a quick test render. And yep, I've got some random shades of red. Now, what I might do is change that round a little bit and see if I can shuffle these random colors a little bit. So if I select my random effector for the color, if I go to the effector tab, I can change the seed value. And this is something we tried before. And we can see as I click through, it's changing the random values and distributing them differently. So I'm just going to pick one that I like. That looks pretty good to me. Let's do a Shift R, do a test render. So now we can see we've got these slightly different shades of red over the truck now. So that's pretty much what I wanted. Now that red, that dark red is maybe a little dark, so I might just double click my shader, go into the multi-shader, and that dark red, I might just make that just a tiny bit lighter, and that one there just a tiny bit lighter as well. I just don't want quite so much variation. It's pretty subtle, but that will do for now. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. I'm happy with that at this stage. Now there's one thing I want to do with my render settings. What we're using here is some really strong sort of primary type colors, and I don't have any lighting in my scene just yet. But one thing I want to add is a render function that creates some subtle lighting effects without actually lighting. So I'll show you what that means. In my render settings, so I've got this clapperboard icon with a little gear on it. I can also hit Command B. That will open my render settings. I prefer using the physical renderer for most things, so I'm going to set that to physical. And while I'm here, let's just jump into that physical renderer. And what I want to do is leave the sampler on adaptive. Let's set the sampling quality to automatic. And I'm just going to leave this shading error threshold at about 20% for now. This is basically a quality setting. When it comes to rendering my final project, I'll turn this down to 10% or maybe lower, which will give me better anti-aliasing and less grain or noise. It'll make my renders take a little bit longer, but I'll do that for my final production render, but I'll leave it on 20% just for now. So in the render settings, what I want to do is I want to add a rendering effect that gives me some more subtle lighting. If I go to the effects menu, click on that, I'm going to add this thing called Ambient Occlusion. And what Ambient Occlusion does is it shades objects that are close to each other. So in the real world, light bounces around over all sorts of surfaces, and in little nooks and crannies you'll get shadows build up or little darker areas because objects close to each other are blocking, all the light that bounces around. So ambient occlusion means the ambient light is the light that bounces around. Occlusion means to block, so it's blocking the light that bounces around. So all I'm going to do is turn that on. That's it. It was just under my effects menu. I don't have to do anything else, but if I hit Shift R now to do a test render, what we should see is we get a lot of really subtle shading in these little wee nooks and crannies, all these little wee edges that are close together. And because I'm using my picture viewer here, I can click between my last render and this one, and I can see there's a really big difference between the shading on these two renders. And this one is much more defined because we've got this ambient occlusion shading these darkened areas. The form is much easier to see, and it's a much more realistic lighting system, and it's adding a lot of really good detail to my scene. Now, ambient occlusion is not technically a lighting system because it's not adding light, it's actually adding shading into the scene. So that's ambient occlusion. It doesn't add much to your render time, a little bit, not a huge amount. and it's really worth using. So I use it on pretty much everything. Okay, the other thing I can do here is actually create a physical sky and just see what this looks like with my physical sky in there as well. So let's go create light physical sky. Give that a second to kick in. I'm going to hit Shift R again. Now I haven't changed any settings on the physical sky here, but now I can see we've got some shadows here, some actual shadows, and the lighting is a lot more dynamic. I've got this physical sky background. Now, if you want to here, obviously you can mess around with your physical sky. You can change its settings. We could jump into the physical sky and let's have a look at the presets. I'm going to create some kind of a blue sky preset. This one looks interesting. Hazy blue. Let's grab that. Give that a second and let's hit Shift R again. Just let that render. I'm using a 5-year-old laptop here to render these, so my renders are pretty slow. But so now we've got some shadows falling on the wall in the background. We've got some clouds in the sky. That's looking quite nice. Now, one thing we have to be careful if we've got shadows, when the truck is in its pieces and up in the air before it assembles, have to be careful that the shadows don't fall onto the wall. So let's just go back to this section here, somewhere around here, and hit Shift R. And what I want to check is that the shadows aren't... Okay, we've got shadows. Here we go. Here's the shadows from the truck falling on the wall here. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to rotate my sky around a little so that the shadows are in a slightly different direction, so I don't have this problem, because I don't want to have, as the wall is assembling, I don't want to have this shadow of the pieces of my truck hanging out on the wall. So let's jump out of here for a second. Let's go to my options menu and turn on shadows, because then I'll get a rough idea of where my shadows are. There we go. So now I can see that's exactly what I was talking about. Here's my shadows from my truck sitting on the wall here. That's going to look really ugly while it's drawing. So what I'm going to do is grab my physical sky, grab the rotate tool, and I'm just going to rotate the sky around so that the shadows go in a different direction and they're not falling on that truck. I'm going to turn mine just so that they're heading off a little bit, and I'm looking at the shadows on my truck here as well as I spin it around. And let's just go to the end of my scene. There's the shadows on the wall behind it. My camera's down here somewhere. Let's just jump into that camera and do a quick test render. And let's see how that's looking. So that looks good. Actually, the lighting on that truck looks better, I think, this way around. And I know that the shadows aren't going to fall on that wall. So that's all looking pretty good. I'm liking that. That's great. So, just to tidy this up a little bit, what I'm going to do now is put the truck elements in their own layer. Now, this fracture has a lot of objects in it. I don't want to go through and select them all individually, so what I'm going to do is shift select these objects that make up the truck system. I'm going to right click and go select children, and that will make sure it selects all of the pieces inside the fracture as well. Now I can right click that, add it to a new layer, go to my layers menu, and let's make this truck. Excellent, I can lock that off as well. That's all done. This is looking great. Let's save that and carry on to the next part.